Well, to talk more about China's relations with Russia, we're now joined by Anil Gupta from the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Mr. Gupta, welcome to the broadcast.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Let's talk about these two countries and their relations, because certainly there's been quite a few more visits of late. We've had about 4 visits, I believe, between Chinese President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. What constitutes a win, really, with respect to capitalizing on the newfound proximity between these two countries? Not geographically, but diplomatically.
Essentially, the way I look at the relationship between China and Russia, that the geopolitical relationship is very close, and I think we could say that it's getting closer. And that clearly has an impact on the economic relationship, which also is getting closer. But at the same time, this is on the economic side, the relationship, I think, is going to run into some headwinds. Basically, because it's an unequal relationship. If you look at the size of the two economies, China's economy vis-a-vis Russia, the gap between the two is getting larger in terms of the relative strengths. Russia is obviously very strong in terms of energy, oil, gas. China is very strong in manufacturing. But if you look at the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, oil and gas are actually not the growth stories. Manufacturing is going to be a growth story, of course, services, but also manufacturing. And the growth rates of the two economies are very different. So I think, I see headwinds. I mean, the economic relationship is getting closer. But at the same time, if you look at China accounts for about 11% of Russia's total trade, about 18% of Russia's exports, less in terms of imports, but overall about 11-12%. And China is Russia's biggest trading partner. Russia, on the other hand, accounts for only about 2% of China's world trade. So we can see, if in fact oil and gas were growth stories, then I think this would be a good situation for Russia. But if they are not, which I suspect is more likely to be the case, this could run into an increasingly unequal story.
But certainly Western sanctions are also playing a role in all of this, essentially driving Moscow towards Beijing in some ways.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's Western sanctions are driving, and naturally the geographic proximity, between Russia and China. So the pipeline can go from Siberia into China, for example. Of course, it has to go a long way. So those things are big pluses. But at the same time, if I elaborate on my earlier point, is that the Chinese economy is slowing down. It's also in the process of transforming itself from investment-driven to actually domestic consumption-driven to services-driven, moving away from manufacturing. So therefore, China's need, and again, if you look at just the renewables, non-fossil, China is one of the biggest, in fact, growth stories in terms of solar power, wind power. And so therefore, if you look at the future, China's dependence on fossil fuel itself will decline. Number one. Number two, fossil fuel prices will decline. The number of sources around the world, Central Asia in particular, from which China already is a big importer of oil and gas. So therefore, I think the Russia-China story, economic story, is a story of growing cooperation on many fronts, but it's probably going to run into some headwinds.
One of the things I found interesting was Russia's efforts to sort of diversify the relationship. One of the ideas and proposals they've made is having a national payment system of their own that harmonizes with China's UnionPay. So MirPay would work alongside China's UnionPay. How are you seeing financial sector cooperation play out, and what would that bring to both of these economies?
Yeah, I think, the financial, in my view, cooperation along all dimensions is good, and eliminating any type of friction in trade, investment, economic relationship between two countries is, in fact, I believe the more the merrier. And so, harmonizing Russia's Mir with China's UnionPay, I think that's very good. But at the same time, the way I look at it is that, what it does is that you can use a credit card from one country into another. For instance, trade can be directly between rubles and yuan without having to go through a third currency. But again, large transactions don't need harmonization.
Right.
And so this harmonization affects small trade, which doesn't really move the needle. It's good, but I don't think it's going to move the needle.
And good for tourism as well. And we'll have a story on that in just a moment. Our thanks to you, Mr. Gupta, for coming in. Appreciate it. Well,